The rules of responsibility, fidelity, and honesty did not apply to Kennedy men. Their confidence that they were above the ordinary rules of man bred in Joe's sons a pattern which would ultimately destroy them. The recklessness of the Kennedy men had many facets: a disregard for their own safety, a thirst for dangerous liaisons with unlikely women, and an unwillingness to delay their personal gratification, even when it could have life-threatening consequences. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription. This is our first episode of a new series, and I'm super excited about it. Last summer, the book that we actually started my channel with was called Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed by Maureen Callahan. And one of the things that we loved about it was that it walked through many stories of the Kennedys across the decades and told us, focused on the women's part in those stories. So we got to hear a lot of the Kennedy lore and understand the family tree of the Kennedys. Yes, I brought back out my Kennedy family tree that shows the parents and the 9 children, as well as other relations. But this summer, what I thought we would do is do a correlated book that actually came out in 1996, and it is called The Kennedy Men: 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets. So this was before the death of JFK Jr., and it was shortly after the death of Jackie. Jackie had died in 1994. JFK Jr. passed in 1999. So this book was released between those 2 times while he was still alive. But it shows here Joe Kennedy. It has Ted, RFK, of course, JFK. We have Marilyn here. And we have other Kennedys. These are some of the RFK side. There's Ted with JFK Jr. and of course we have Jackie. So the dust jacket tells us in 1914, a young Boston banker made 2 critical decisions. He would make $1 million before he was 30, and he would found a dynasty. The banker, Joseph P. Kennedy, was the brash, ambitious grandson of Irish immigrants. His bride, the former Rose Fitzgerald, shared his Irish Catholic roots and brought powerful political connections to the match. Together, they built an empire that would include a president and 2 senators and would change the course of American history. The Kennedy Men: 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets by Nellie Bly. The facts of their lives are the stuff of legend. They are America's closest thing to royalty, and their tragedies and triumphs have fascinated the public for decades. Few families have been more famous, more photographed, more admired, and vilified than the Kennedys. And for 3 generations, Kennedy men have been a law unto themselves. Here, for the first time, is the truth about the secret love affairs, the lurid sex scandals that have been whispered about for years, the private misfortunes, the tragedies that turned them into American heroes, and the appalling personal behavior that has left a long list of victims in its wake. It is also the story of Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s unparalleled rise to fame and fortune, the tale of a ruthless, reckless man who possessed a fatal flaw. For Joe Kennedy and his sons, winning was all that mattered, and the Kennedys created their own rules. This way of life was passed on to the 3rd generation with tragic results. I will say, this book carries with it the same thing we talked about with Ask Not, which is, it does pull on many other books for research, but it is not as if Nellie Bly, that is a pen name, went around interviewing these people. Instead, it cites other books as the sources for the research that was done. And that's not to say that there's not. It has a long list in the bibliography, kind of like Ask Not in that way. Not that there is no research done. So we're going to jump right in. Our first focus is going to be on the man at the center of the Kennedy dynasty, Joe. One of the reasons why I chose this book is because I do want to understand Joe Kennedy better. And this seems like the most accessible and kind of summer fun reading way for you and I to get familiar with the story arc of Joseph P. Kennedy. So let's get going. Here is the introduction. And I think it's very interesting, actually, that Maureen Callahan, I think, stole this same quote. This is what she uses to start Ask Not. And I just find it interesting that she wrote the book that's kind of the companion part to this book about the Kennedy men and their scandals and secrets. She wrote the stories of the women and opened with this same quote. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. That is a great quote, and apparently it was not originally thought of by Maureen Callahan to connect with the Kennedys. Instead, it was this person, Nellie Bly. Introduction. It all began with obsession. Joseph Patrick Kennedy wanted Rose Fitzgerald, and he was willing to do anything to get her. He would wait 6 years for her father's approval. He would put up with Rose's religiosity and her old man's notoriety for as long as it took. As in so many other things he strived for, he refused to consider failure, but once he had her, he would lose interest and move on to new conquests, setting a pattern that still prevails among Kennedy men to this day. Together, Joe and Rose would raise 9 children, born during a span of almost 15 years. So great was the age difference between the older children, Rosemary, Joe Jr., Kathleen, and John, and the younger ones, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward, that they form almost 2 separate generations, with Eunice on the cusp of both. The older generation was the golden one. Except for poor Rosemary, they were gifted with everything: good looks, charm, and serious intelligence. They were achievers who benefited from their parents' time and attention. As the younger children grew up, they received less attention. Their parents were distracted by travel, business, and the glorious debacle that was Joe's stint as U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James. Yes. We need to understand Joe and Rose, the matriarch and patriarch of this clan, started out in Boston. Her dad was the mayor. We're going to hear more about this. But then they had their 9 children. And then Joe, the father, was appointed as the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. So they went and they lived there, and to the court of St. James is what it was called. And some of the Kennedy children were near-aged peers to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. Of course, she was Princess Elizabeth at the time, but they knew each other. Some of the daughters were introduced at court and, before the king and queen. So very interesting. That was the position that gave the Kennedy sons in particular a very clear understanding of global politics and international relations that set them up. Now, not Teddy. He was way too young. But this was what set up Joe Jr., who sadly passed away in World War II, and JFK to have this remarkable ability to understand global politics at very young ages. So that is the thing that became the launching pad for their political careers. Joe and Rose shared a philosophy about child rearing. Raise the oldest ones right, and they'll take care of the younger ones. In Joe's master plan, it was entirely possible that once he had installed his oldest son, Joe Jr., into the White House, that the others, quiet, studious Jack, devoutly religious Bobby, and fat-headed baby brother Teddy would follow. In Joe's rigorous training schools at Palm Beach and Hyannisport, the boys learned they could trust only the family. Winning was everything. And Kennedys were a special breed, endowed by God and Joe Kennedy to someday rule America. But the boys also learned something else. The rules of responsibility, fidelity, and honesty did not apply to Kennedy men. Their confidence that they were above the ordinary rules of man bred in Joe's sons a pattern which would ultimately destroy them. The recklessness of the Kennedy men had many facets: a disregard for their own safety, a thirst for dangerous liaisons with unlikely women, and an unwillingness to delay their personal gratification, even when it could have life-threatening consequences. This quality characterizes the Kennedy men still, even into the third generation. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr.'s family-bred love of the limelight and competitiveness with a younger brother who suddenly threatened to overshadow him sent the young naval commander on the wartime mission that killed him. I have not heard this, so I'm interested to understand how this author is saying that the oldest son was driven by competitiveness with JFK and that that's part of what led to his death. So I'm interested in that story. John F. Kennedy's conviction that Kennedys were above consequences encouraged the president to maintain an Oval Office affair with the mistress of a mafia capo, to encourage an invasion of Cuba, and even to disregard safety advice and ride in a topless limousine through downtown Dallas, making himself an easy target for his assassin. There's a little victim blaming for us. It was similar recklessness that led Robert F. Kennedy into a disastrous affair with his brother's discarded mistress, Marilyn Monroe. I still am on the fence about whether or not RFK had anything to do with or was the reason for what happened to Marilyn Monroe the night that she died, but he was at her house that morning for sure. We know that. She died that night. So there's an interesting connection that is worth a dig, perhaps by me in some future part of this channel or perhaps by somebody else, but it is an interesting situation. It also spurred him to follow his brother on the campaign trail with fatal results. I don't mean to keep interrupting the readings, but I will say we read a book by Rita Dallas. It's called The Kennedy Case. Rita Dallas was Joseph Kennedy, the father's nurse in the final 8 years of his life. And we read the account where RFK came home and talked to his parents and told them outright, I've decided to run for president. And their silence and spoken support belying the feeling of dread and concern that they had in their hearts. So if you're at all interested in that, that was a moving situation where you really could identify with the parents of, they've already lost one son and now they've really lost two sons at that point because Joe Jr. had died during World War II. They'd lost JFK and here's their third son coming to them and saying he's going to run for president. And of course, only an inherited sense of invincibility could have sent Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the wild ride off Chappaquiddick Bridge that left a young woman dead under murky circumstances that have never been adequately explained. This brings us to the second sad legacy of the Founding Father, and that is the family's conviction that media is a tool to be controlled and manipulated. The Kennedy men can certainly be forgiven for this belief. Starting with Joe, Kennedys have had a special relationship with the press. Joe virtually owned the esteemed columnist Arthur Kroc, his man at the New York Times, and he managed simultaneous close friendships with two very different press lords, Henry Luce and William Randolph Hearst. I believe that's the father of Patty Hearst. Is that right? Or Patsy Hearst? Patty Hearst. Joe put all of this to good use to promote the public image of his sons, beginning with Joe Jr., and after his death, Jack. Unfortunately, this only encouraged the Kennedy spirit of invincibility. When Teddy's irresponsible actions led to the drowning death of a young woman, most of the press accepted his version of the story, discrepancies and all. Their philosophy seemed to be that since Teddy and his family had already suffered so much, no one should question his behavior too closely. Encouraged by this attitude, Teddy proceeded to revel in 2 decades of womanizing, barroom escapades, and drug-taking, all the time protected by the press. Yes, he was the remaining Kennedy of 4 sons with 2 assassinated brothers. So in a lot of ways, this man who became a senator was guarded by the press to do the things that he did. It was therefore a great shock to him when he interrupted his revel long enough to declare for the presidency in 1980, only to be ambushed in an interview with trusted journalist Robert Mudd. It turned out that Mudd was not in the Kennedy pocket after all. Poor Teddy was exposed to the world as a bumbling, incoherent fellow who was less than forthright about topics like his unconventional marriage and the events at Chappaquiddick. This interview signaled a turning point for the Kennedys. A new generation of women was uncomfortable with the conflict between Teddy's public position on women's rights and his notorious private behavior. His friends in the media had always assured Teddy that the presidency was his for the asking, which is what friends would say. Look, your brother was president. Your other brother was killed in pursuit of the presidency. When you're ready, you should run. Not when it's Teddy Kennedy. But when he actually put his name on primary ballots, he discovered that the American voter was no pushover for family legend. It's interesting because this book was written in 1996, and so there's speculation sometimes about things that now we know as history. So this is going to be interesting. And there's also things that, like, there's conversations about that middle generation of will they or won't they have political power, that now we don't see this generation of Kathleen Kennedy Townsend and Mark Kennedy Shriver and Ted Jr. and Patrick having political power. But at this point, there was a lot of speculation about it. So I'm going to skip that part. It says, with the 1994 death of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, perhaps the only woman who survived the Kennedy experience and went on to make a rewarding life on her own terms, and the 1995 death of matriarch Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, it seems that a chapter in our nation's history has come to a close. The Palm Beach mansion, full of the ghosts of 3 generations of dynastic dreams, has been sold and will be turned into a museum. Has it? Do you guys know? Does anybody live in Palm Beach? Have you been to this museum? I mean, if that is a Kennedy museum, I'd love to go and see it sometime. That would be fascinating. Today, the family is scattered and seldom comes together except for weddings and funerals, and of course, political campaigns. Yet, the name Kennedy is still magic. It is still closely tied with 50 years of our country's history. The family has moved into American legend, but how much of that legend is true? Let's take a look at the record. That is the promise of the introduction. So we get a quote at the start of part 1. It says, An American Gothic. A quote by Claire Booth Luce. It says, where else but in Gothic fiction, where else among real people could one encounter such triumphs and tragedies, such beauty and charm and ambition and pride and human wreckage, such dedication to the best and lapses into the mire of life? Such vulgar, noble, driven, generous, self-centered, loving, suspicious, devious, honorable, vulnerable, indomitable people. No wonder the American public, their audience, for that matter, much of the world, has been fascinated by them. That's interesting. It's talking about Gothic fiction, but of course the implication is here in the Kennedy family, we have all of the above. So with this chapter, I just want to say the goals that I have are to learn about Joe and Rose and their beginnings. I also want to point out that in Ask Not, the Rose chapter was our most disappointing chapter. Everyone else got like 18 pages of information. She wrote like 6 pages about Rose. And so I am interested in learning more about Rose. Chapter 1. The Marriage of Joe and Rose. Nigel Hamilton wrote, the Kennedy family myth about JFK is that he was this kind of glorious person, produced by a wonderful set of parents whose whole purpose was to bring up clean living, honest children dedicated to public service. That is baloney. The Kennedy household was an emotional wasteland. Very true, Nigel Hamilton. He is the British biographer who wrote JFK, Reckless Youth. He's now 81 years old, and his assessment there is spot on. The Kennedy household was an emotional wasteland. Joseph P. Kennedy, the self-described youngest banker in America, and Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald could not have known what lay ahead as they stood in the private chapel of William Cardinal O'Connell on October 7th, 1914, and said their marriage vows. All they knew was that they were young and in love and shared the promise of a golden future. It was a low-key, modest ceremony because Rose's father, John F. Fitzgerald, the recently retired mayor of Boston, was under a cloud of scandal. His nickname was Honey Fitz. In the years to come, Joe and Rose would found a dynasty that would change the course of American history. But they would also create an almost century-long epic, marked by more tragedy and violence than a Greek play. Joe's father, Patrick Joseph, known as PJ, was an East Boston saloon keeper and ward boss. So this is Joe's father. This would be JFK and RFK and Teddy's grandfather. By 1900, the sons of the once despised Irish Catholic immigrants had come to dominate the city's politics. PJ was a master at behind-the-scenes deal-making, dispensing patronage, arbitrating feuds, and he taught his son Joe everything he knew. Born in Boston on September 6, 1888, while PJ was serving in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, one of Joe's earliest memories was the day that two of his father's constituents arrived at the Kennedy house with the good news that each had cast 128 votes that day. Yes, two men, each cast 128 votes in the election. So, charges of election fraud, which definitely plagued JFK in 1960, originated early before. This is Boston, 1888. With an eye to the future, PJ and his wife, the former Mary Hickey, removed 13-year-old Joe from the East Boston Catholic school system and placed him in Boston Latin School. From then on, Joe's education would be strictly secular and first class. Boston Latin was one of the finest schools in the country. Its alumni included Cotton Mather, Benjamin Franklin, and John Quincy Adams. And it was also a bastion of the Protestant establishment, the Boston Brahmins. When it was time for college, Harvard was the obvious choice. At Harvard, Joe, handsome, red-haired, and athletic, participated in sports and an active social life, but was ignored by the prestigious clubs. Joe was chosen for the club Hasty Pudding. It's a Harvard social club, which was a significant accomplishment for a Boston Irish Catholic at that time. He graduated with the class of 1912. The classic story told about Joe at Harvard concerns a baseball game. Joe was determined to win his letter in baseball his senior year, but he had not been permitted to play in a single game, having been beaten out at first place by Charles McLaughlin. During the ninth inning of the final game of the season against Yale, with Harvard leading 4-1, Chick McLaughlin, that's his nickname, who was now pitcher and captain for the team, suddenly asked his coach to put Kennedy in for the final play, thus assuring Joe of the varsity letter he coveted. Tradition dictated that McLaughlin, as captain, should get the winning ball, but Joe refused to hand it over. So he gets in on one play at the end because of this guy McLaughlin. So he letters, and then he gets the ball somehow and refuses to give it up. Long after the game, when McLaughlin was asked why he ever put Joe Kennedy in for the final play, he confessed that a few days before the game, some of P.J. Kennedy's ward healers had spoken privately to him. They were aware that Chick wanted to apply for a city license to operate a movie theater after he graduated from Harvard. Either he played ball by putting Joe in the game, or he would be out of the theater business before he ever began. The message that stayed with Joe was that anyone and anything can be bought, even a Harvard letter. It was the beginning of sportsmanship, Kennedy style. So PJ puts in the fix for Joe. I mean, this has so many echoes to later, that there's political fixes that happen, that there's threats, people coming along beside, grabbing prizes that aren't yours. Later, Ted Kennedy has his own Harvard cheating scandal. Now we get to Rose. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald was born in Boston on July 22nd, 1890, the first of 6 children, 3 of them girls. Rose's mother shunned the limelight, and Rose, as outgoing and vivacious as Honey Fitz, became her father's companion. Together, Rose and her father toured Europe, traveled to Washington and Palm Beach, and Rose threw out the first ball at Fenway Park. At 15, she graduated second in her class. Rose's lavish coming out party was attended by more than 450 guests, including the governor of Massachusetts, but she was ignored by the elite WASP Women's Club. That's White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So she was Irish Catholic. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants did not welcome the Boston Irish Catholics into their social situations. Resilient Rose founded her own, the Ace of Clubs, limited to young women like herself who had studied abroad and spoke fluent French. The great disappointment of Rose's young life was that she was not allowed to attend Wellesley College, where she had been accepted. At the last minute, her father, influenced by the cardinal and concerned with his Irish Catholic power base, rejected her choice of a secular college and insisted she attend a convent school. So, interestingly, this model of Jo getting to attend secular educational resources and then Rose not became something that patterned in their own children. For the most part, their sons got secular educations and were told, although she was not given to bitterness, she did return to her disappointment about Wellesley again and again in later years. Strangely enough, though, she did not encourage any of her daughters to pursue a secular education, and she sent them to the same Sacred Heart convent schools that she had attended. So she held them back the same way that she had been held back. Jo and Rose knew each other well, having spent summers since Rose was 5 years old in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, the crowded beach community that was favored by prosperous Boston Irish Catholics. Their romance began in earnest the summer of 1906. Full of confidence and ambition, Jo had, according to Rose, the most wonderful smile that seemed to light up his entire face from within and made an instant impression on everyone he met. Rose discovered that she and Jo shared an ambition to live life to its fullest. Together, they dismissed the commonplace. Now, I just remind you, Rose was 15, Jo was 17. So young. Each had grown up the favored child of the family. This sounds dangerous. Indulged, encouraged, nurtured. They had only known appreciation and success, and they had every reason to expect to conquer the world. It's interesting. On the one hand, there's this drive and possibility that exists when you have this, the favored child of two different families, both politically connected, both with money, both socially well off, combining forces, right? So there's so much possibility. And yet also, on the other hand, there's this almost narcissistic sense of like, nobody's going to beat us. Nobody's going to get ahead of us. And this inability to reckon with sorrow and loss because they haven't really known it. Neither one has had difficulty, at least as far as we've read yet. We'll see as we get further into their stories. They both valued family. Her father, Honey Fitz, relied so much on his 6 brothers, most of whom visited him at City Hall daily, that the Fitzgeralds were dubbed, quote, the royal family, and, quote, the Fitzgerald dynasty. Responding to charges of nepotism, Honey Fitz said, "If I were to be without their assistance tomorrow, I would not think of running for public office ever again." That's interesting. To me, perhaps to you as well, it foreshadows the relationship between Jack and Bobby. That Bobby, when he was appointed Attorney General to his presidential brother, people did charge him with nepotism. And yet, especially given the assassination and the way that we know it played out, you can kind of identify with Jack going, I need one person at least that I can fully bare my soul to and fully trust their judgment, who's in the rooms with me, who can help me sort out which people are actually with us. After Jo graduated from Harvard, PJ arranged a job for him as a state bank examiner. And for the next year and a half, Jo traveled eastern Massachusetts reviewing bank records. which would be a fantastic, interesting job, wouldn't it? To get to peek behind the scenes at different jobs, if that was your goal, was to be a banker. When Columbia Trust, in which PJ had a substantial interest, was threatened with a hostile takeover, young Joe managed to rally enough support and hard cash to save it. He then informed the directors, including his father PJ, that he wanted to be the president of the bank. They proceeded to vote him in, and at 26, he could claim to be the youngest bank president in the country. Actually, it was more accurate to call him the youngest bank president in Massachusetts, but that phrase was not as impressive. On Joe and Rose's wedding day, only the immediate families of the bride and groom were present. The early morning nuptial mass was followed by a wedding breakfast for 75 guests at the Fitzgerald Mansion. After the reception, the couple left for a 2-week honeymoon at the Greenbrier in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. You can see the quaintness of that even for a rich family with plenty of money who had traveled abroad. Remember, Rose's club was young ladies who had studied abroad and spoke fluent French. Even still, for them, the honeymoon was, let's just go out to the Greenbrier in West Virginia. It doesn't seem uber glamorous, does it? I think within one generation, the speed of travel, the commonality of travel, the ability of people to easily hop the pond was dramatically changed. But at this point, you took your honeymoon for 2 weeks in West Virginia. On their return, young Mr. and Mrs. Joseph P. Kennedy would set up house in a modest 9-room wood frame house at 83 Beals Street in the western suburb of Brookline. Rose played her piano, a wedding gift from her Fitzgerald uncles, while Joe set out to make his fortune with a brilliant and imaginative combination of stock speculation, mortgage foreclosure, and war profiteering. For Joe and Rose, a key element in the master plan was the press. When Rose gave birth to their first child, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., on July 25, 1915, Honey Fitz immediately telephoned the Boston Post with the news, quote, "I'm sure he's going to make a good man on the platform one day," Honey Fitz announced. "Is he going into politics? Well, of course, he is going to be President of the United States." So that is grandfather Honey Fitz on day 1 of Joseph P. Kennedy Jr.'s life, saying he would be the President of the United States. That is high ambition from the very beginning. Well, we are going to leave it there. Let me know in the comments if you're excited about this book, what you're looking forward to, if there are particular stories you're interested in, and what you notice about Joe and Rose. We will continue with their story next time. We'll get into all different aspects of their lives, including Joe Kennedy's stint in Hollywood. So we will get through that and work through this book together. I'm looking forward to it with you. I hope you are too. Come back next time for part 2 of the Kennedy Men. Have a great day. Bye.